Good afternoon, everyone. Come on in, have a seat, please. We can get started. How was everyone's lunch? Good. All right. We a little pumped up after that dynamic speaker during lunch? Yes? Okay. All right. Yes, thank you. There we go. So this afternoon, we're going to be speaking about domestic violence, or also called intimate partner violence. Domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and families. Understanding the dynamics of domestic violence will help service providers and other system partners respond and support survivors. Today, we have two individuals from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Maria Williams is the Director of Housing at the PCADV. She specializes in the development and implementation of housing strategies, funding, and flexible direct service supports for survivors. Tara Ulrich. Tara Ulrich began working in the movement to end domestic violence as a community educator in 2013, providing domestic violence and sexual violence prevention education to community members. Shortly after, Tara became director of a HUD-funded transitional housing program for women combating substance use disorders and experiencing homelessness. Tara has continued her work at the intersections of trauma, homelessness, and substance use by operating other successful domestic violence housing first programs, as well as other housing modalities that support survivors. And I spoke with both presenters. They really would like a engaging audience, so feel free to ask questions throughout. As you know, being a speaker on the platform, you feed off of the audience energy, so I really would appreciate you to utilize those carbs and chicken you had at lunch and just really engage with one another, especially with such a serious topic as domestic violence. Thank you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm going to pull up my notes real quick. My colleague Tara and I work for the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and that is a statewide membership-based organization. We function as the pass-through entity for funding for domestic violence programs that are at the community level. So chances are, if you live in Pennsylvania, in your county, there's a domestic violence program. Many of you, I would assume, know what that program is, which is fantastic. If you don't and you're curious, please let us know. There's an app on our website that can help you find that program, but we're also happy to help you discover what that is. Tara and I spend a lot of time talking with folks that are on the front line. So one of the best solutions for survivors to gain safety and then to stay safe is to have safe and stable housing. We're really excited to be here today because this intersection of policy development and rights for survivors within housing is sort of a new frontier. Survivors aren't a protected class. And there are no laws directly in the state of Pennsylvania that protect survivor housing. So survivors can be protected under the Human Rights Act in a number of different categories should they fall into those categories, which is great, and the expansion has really helped with that. But there aren't any laws that directly support the tenancy rights of survivors. Now, if you live in Philly, there are, which is great. So some of the local jurisdictions have figured this out, which is wonderful. But it doesn't support the statewide need that we know exists. So Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence was founded in 1976, 1976. We're not that old. We are the oldest coalition in the country, though, which is pretty cool. I feel like Pennsylvania always has the oldest of everything, so it's not that novel. But we have 58 member programs across the state in almost every county. If your county doesn't have one, it means that they're covered by another entity that's very close by. When the founding mothers of the movement came together and decided that they wanted to establish a coalition, one of the things that they knew for certain is that they never wanted a survivor to have to leave their immediate area to get the help and support and services they need, which is fantastic. Since then, we've grown immensely, and now PCADV has a vested interest in housing, which Tara and I are very grateful for, as we know that it really is the solution for safety for survivors. So survivors can get evicted in their housing for a number of reasons, and they're often not related to the behavior of the survivor, which is tricky. So sometimes the eviction happens because of an abusive partner's behavior, or it may happen because of noise complaints. If you follow housing news at all, for over the last number of years, particularly in the suburban Philadelphia counties, there has been report after report after report of noise violations that are directly impacting survivors' ability to retain their housing. This is something that our policy team at PCADV is working on, but again, knowing that there's the potential for direct assistance for survivors from direct policy that would support the tenancy would make a big difference. Landlords often view survivors as a risk, and we talked earlier today about landlords and the role that they play, and what we know is that they are business people, they respond to money, and so it's been PCADV's policy to make sure that we're establishing funds that can help survivors pay their rent. We're the pass-through for HUD Rapid Rehousing for the majority of the state, for our member programs, and we'll continue to build that to make sure that we have the money to actually work with landlords in ways that they'll respond to. I think that we often hope that landlords will have a soft spot, and sometimes they do, and it's wonderful when you have a local landlord who is a survivor themselves, or who their parents were, and so they want to support survivors in housing, but we know that that's rare. So making sure that funding is available to really do that work with landlords is essential. So it's important too to talk about survivors because, as was mentioned, the majority of women and children who are experiencing homelessness are also survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, what we sort of look under the umbrella of gender-based violence. What we know from data is that 80% of homeless families have experienced domestic violence. And what we also know is that the majority of folks of color, LGBTQ plus folks, and other folks may not even report that violence occurs because of the police violence that they're at risk of. So the system is flawed, like deeply flawed. We're trying to use tools that were not established to support the people that need the support the most. In doing that, then making sure that we can be as active and progressive in lawmaking as possible is really, really essential. 50% of female-headed households report domestic violence as the direct cause of their homelessness. And while confidential domestic violence shelter has been the response from the domestic violence movement for many years, what we know is that a survivor is far less likely to return to an abusive partner if they have safe and stable housing and if they have a lease in their own name. So advocacy with landlords is incredibly important, and having statewide policy and folks interested in that policy development is essential to making sure that survivors stay safe in Pennsylvania. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tara, and there we go. We're going to talk today about how to best support survivor safety, because there aren't official policy in Pennsylvania that supports survivor safety. Where we really see that support happening is on the interpersonal level. And so even if you don't work with people one-on-one, chances are you're somehow involved in the support of folks finding fair, equitable, safe housing. Knowing that you can support others in safety planning with survivors is essential, or you can do that work yourself, and we're going to talk about that today. It's far easier than you might think it is, so getting that word out is important to us. And then we're going to talk about the Violence Against Women Act, because where survivors do have support is at the federal level, which is great, until policymakers get in place that decide that they don't deserve that any longer, and then that may be at risk. So making sure that VAWA is codified on the state level is so important. So we'll talk a little bit about that and housing options for survivors, how that plays out in Pennsylvania, and then wrap up with just some tools for you to use when you're interacting with survivors or when you're supporting organizations that are.
It's a little treacherous coming up and down here. Hi, everyone. My name is Tara Ulrich. As Maria said, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Housing Advocacy Specialist. As Renessa explained, I have experience on the ground serving survivors and building HUD-funded rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and transitional housing options. So kind of where I come in is like, I've done this. And so like Maria said, you know, survivors often get evicted for a variety of reasons. I worked with a survivor one time who her first day in the new apartment, the abusive party broke in, destroyed all her things, busted out windows. She was evicted the next day because there were no protections in place, and they had that whole, you know, no noise after a certain time. And that happens regularly to DV survivors. Sometimes, if they're lucky enough to be working with a program who the advocates know what their rights are and know how to go about filing complaints and things like that, sometimes they might get some kind of remedy, but it doesn't change the fact that tonight they don't have anywhere to go, right? And so what we hope that we'll leave you all with today is some tools to be able to support survivors. Okay, so we first wanted to go over what are kind of, we call them as the housing assistance buckets, and these are kind of the different programs that are out there and available to survivors. So we have our federally funded programs. Those are our rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and there's now, excuse me, a new component that they refer to as the joint component, or a combination of transitional housing and rapid rehousing. There are also the housing authorities. That's where your housing choice vouchers come into place. And then there's also state and foundational funded housing. Those are usually much smaller, kind of prevention and diversion things, also rapid rehousing and flexible funding. We put up here the various housing options for survivors, and the reason that we do that is to show you that no matter what kind of housing program you are running, you are working with survivors, even if you don't know that you're working with survivors. And the statistics say that 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence somewhere in their lifetime. So if you look around this room and check out how many women are in here and pick out 1 in 4. So you are all working with survivors. These housing options are all available to survivors. However, survivors may not always know about them. So we have to make sure that we are developing policies, developing partnerships so that survivors have access and opportunity. I forget which gentleman was talking about access and opportunity this morning, but the same thing goes for survivors. As Maria said, for a long time, the response for survivors was an emergency shelter, and that's simply because that's what programs had. What we know now is that a lot of times a survivor may not need to come into an emergency shelter. It, in fact, may be safer and in their long-term best interest to not come into shelter. So what we're able to do at PCADV, being the pass-through organization for funding, is to be able to allow those local programs to say to a survivor, hey, you know, I could probably get you into rapid rehousing in a couple of weeks. Do you think we could come up with a plan for you to stay safe there? That way they don't have to uproot their entire families, come into shelter, look for a place, uproot again, and then move in. So we're really trying to kind of close that gap, and we're also trying to build partnerships with all these different types of housing options for survivors. So safety planning for survivors. And if you've ever worked with a DV program or you've had the pleasure of seeing one of our colleagues speak, you'll hear us talk about safety planning. And when I first started in the field, I was convinced there was a piece of paper that was the safety plan. And where is the safety plan that I can find? And that does not exist. And that is because safety planning is a process. It does not happen just one time. Safety planning happens over a period of time, and it can be everything from, hey, are you feeling safe right now today? To, hey, let's talk about what happened last time that you tried to leave and what worked, what didn't work, and let's get into that. But it's important to remember that it doesn't just happen one time, you've made a plan and now the person's safe. It happens over and over again because things change, things ebb and flow. For many survivors, if the survivor is, a survivor may go for a while and be doing really well, and then all of a sudden the abusive party pops back up again out of nowhere, and now they've got to go back, and they're back in crisis. And so that safety plan is very important to make sure that it's fluid and that it addresses different aspects of the survivor's life. A survivor may feel super safe at work. Like they know, I'm safe, we have a security guard in the building, nobody's getting in there, I feel great at work. But maybe going to pick the kids up from school is a place where they feel really unsafe because they run into the abusive party's friends or family members, or they really try to undermine me and they make me look like the quote-unquote crazy parent at the school. So it might be, it's probably likely that the survivor will need a safety plan for different aspects of their life. One of the most important things to do if you are a service provider in this room, connect with your local DV program, connect with your local domestic violence program to have a plan in place for referrals. That way, if someone presents to you, or even if maybe you have an inkling that something like this is going on, and then you have that quick, warm handoff relationship with a DV program, or somebody who is a familiar place or face who is coming around a lot, maybe they know that person, and then it's a little bit easier for that person to reach out for help. Many years ago, they were doing a study for something called the lethality assessment, which is a whole other thing. But what they found out was that they studied all of these domestic violence-related homicides, and they found out that of the ones where the folks ultimately died, most of the ones, the people had never contacted a DV organization once. And so a lot of times just that one contact with a DV organization can be enough to, mitigate some of the safety factors and things like that that might lead to what's ultimately the worst outcome of domestic violence. If the survivor is not interested in safety planning with you, don't make that a requirement for them. Maybe they're not interested in telling you everything that's going on. They may have had a bad experience the last time that they disclosed this, or somebody didn't believe them, or what is the point? So, I always, when I am training new advocates, I always say, you ask every time. They may only accept one time. So, but just to keep asking and keep letting them know that you're going to be there. You also want to make sure that you're focusing on their immediate safety. So there's like immediate safety right now in crisis, and then there's long-term safety. So for the immediate safety, looking for things like listen to the survivor and ask what they need. That's number one. It seems so intuitive, but you would be surprised how often folks don't say, hey, what do you need right now? And the thing that happens is survivors may tell you they may look at you like you're crazy. I mean, what do you mean, what do I need? I don't know what I need. But sometimes survivors will identify a very simple thing. Hey, I need to get my kid to school, back and forth to school, and that's what I need to do. And so if you can solve that for them, maybe it clears things up that they're able to work towards solving some other things. So just very simply, what do you need right now? What can I do to help you feel safe? The other thing that sometimes we don't talk about is what do we do if the abusive party is also receiving services from your program, your housing program? These are two people maybe who presented as a married couple, and now you found out that this has happened. It is important to also ensure that the abusive party is not displaced, without any plan or anything like that. If you're able to provide them with services outside of the services that you are providing together, that's very helpful as well. And the reason that we say that is because we know that an abusive person's violence escalates when they are in crisis and when they are under stress. So making this person who has already kind of escalated homeless may just exacerbate that situation. So if it is possible to make sure that that person is still covered under whatever services you are providing or that they have a place to go, that's very important also. sorry. We also want to remember that the survivor may have used violence themselves in self-defense towards the abusive party, or also just because they've reached the end of their rope and they've finally just trying to find a means of gaining some control back over their lives. You know, I've worked with survivors who, you know, they have called the police 80,000 times for being or having violence done to them, but one time they throw a glass and now they've got an assault charge and now they can't ever get into public housing ever again. So just keeping that in mind and having policies at your organization that allow for you to consider things on a case-by-case basis, which really that makes all the difference in the world to survivors. And again, utilize your DV agency for training on how to do safety planning, for training on resources, and have that warm referral process. We talked about some of these ways already, so making sure that your program has policies in place with your DV agencies for warm handoffs, for annual staff trainings on domestic violence is very important as well. And also just to have a contact at the DV agency that you can talk to when some of these situations come up. DV agencies will tell you, you know, if you call and say, hey, I've got this client, Sue Blue, and Sue is really going through it, probably the first thing the DV agency is going to say is we can't confirm or deny whether or not we know that person. And that's fine. That's what they're supposed to say, and good job on them. But that doesn't mean you can't call and say, hey, you know, I've got this situation where I think I'm working with a survivor, but I'm not really sure what to do. Can I bounce some things off of you? And having that contact to be able to lend you the expertise from the DV movement and what these folks know from many, many years of working with survivors can only benefit the folks in your programs. We talked about helping the partner with resources if available. One other thing that, you know, sometimes gets a little tricky, especially for us who maybe don't have the experience in the domestic violence world is, you know, we see this person who has presented as a survivor of domestic violence. They have this abusive party, but they're still seeing that person because there's kids involved. And you really, we want to suggest that you stay away from any kind of policies that restrict that kind of contact between parties. Oh, thank you so much. That restrict that contact between parties, and that's because we never know what the reason for that contact is, right? The survivor may have children with the person. That abusive party may be the survivor's only source of childcare. So if you take away that source of childcare, now they can't get to work, now they're gonna lose their housing too. So again, the more that you can tailor your policies to function on a case-by-case basis so that you're looking at the individual and not just like those blanket policies that may or may not cause the disparate harm that we heard about this morning. The next thing we wanted to talk about was long-term safety planning. So, you know, I think we all like to think once the survivor's in their new home, the credits roll and the survivor's playing on the yard with their kids and their dog and everything's happy, the end, and we all go home. But that's not the case. Survivors often will move and they'll have to move again. And things come up, like I said. But once a survivor has obtained some kind of stability, it's important to make sure to go through with safety planning. Probably one of the most jarring statistics I ever learned when I started in this work was that a survivor will leave 7 to 10 times before they finally leave for good. And that's a lot. So, you know, just knowing that and being able to address those reasons that a survivor might want to go back as they come up in a holistic, trauma-informed way will help the survivor to achieve long-term stability in housing. So making sure that we're looking at safety at home, safety with the kids. If the kids are older kids, it's, you know, it's not unheard of to have a safety plan with the teenage children too. You know, hey, you've been around, you know what's going on in the home. So like, what are you gonna do if you're home by yourself and this person comes over? We also we're doing a better job now, thanks to Maria and our colleagues at PCADV who have really implemented economic justice into a lot of our work. Looking at financial safety and financial abuse and economic justice, you know, one of the main reasons that people don't leave abusive relationships is because they can't afford to. And so anything that we can do to, you know, provide assistance to survivors, eviction mitigation, diversion programs, things like that to help survivors regain financial safety will only go towards their long-term safety. And lastly, looking at things like safety on the job and safety at school. As I said before, you know, a survivor may feel very safe in one place, but not so safe in the other place. The other thing to remember is that it is important to talk about safety on the job, and that's because one of the easiest ways that you can ruin someone's life is to ruin their job, right? And that is a thing that abusive people do to people that they're targeting. So, you know, you as an employer having really good policies around domestic violence, what would you do if one of your employees was a survivor? How would you handle that situation? How would you keep that person safe? Will only go to ensuring the long-term safety of survivors everywhere. And now I'm going to turn it over to Maria to talk about VAWA.
Thanks, Tara. I wanted to just see if there are any questions or concerns or things you'd like to know more about. Yes. That's a great question. So if you couldn't hear her, she asked about DV being exacerbated during COVID-19 pandemic and how has our work changed since then. What's really interesting is that, so each of our member programs has a hotline. And as Tara was saying, you can call that hotline. Survivors obviously call that hotline too. At the beginning of the pandemic, the hotline calls almost stopped because no one was able to have privacy to actually make the call that they needed to make. I can't tell you how many executive directors around the state I talked to that were in a panic. And these are folks that have done this work for a long time. And to not have your hotline ring when you know that it is a life-saving service is really terrifying. So we've been lucky that we've been able to prioritize getting as much funding as we can apply for to make sure that survivors have options. And I think that that's the thing that we've taken away from the pandemic the most is that you can't make different decisions about your life if you only have one option. And so how do we expand options and how do we make sure that those options are available to the communities of survivors that are needing it the most, I think has really become the focus. That was a focus prior to the pandemic, but it's grown since. But what we're seeing is the exact same thing that was talked about here this morning, which is that there was an eviction moratorium. Landlords really look for reasons to evict survivors. So the minute the moratorium ended, there were hundreds of homeless survivors across the state because they were just waiting for the moratorium to be lifted. So since then, we've had to really work to develop, and what we're hoping to do is develop a statewide landlord network that we know of landlords who are maybe even excited to work with survivors, but that might be too much to hope for. So at least willing and happy to take our money, which is really all we ask for at this point. But all of those feelings of like, if we can pull on heartstrings and we can appeal to people, I think have really gone away. And it's really about making sure that we can get money to survivors, particularly BIPOC and queer survivors who need it the most.
What Maria said about the hotline call stopping. About July, when the pandemic kind of like started to ease ease up and things started opening up, I was still at the program, and I know our calls and many other directors that I talked to increased by about 40% at that time. So it went from like nothing to almost twice what we were doing before that.
I think it's tricky because domestic violence services in the United States are so deeply, deeply tied to federal funding and to cooperation with police. And both of those things are, I mean, that's two of the riskiest things you can tie yourself to, truly. And so I think sort of the underbelly of that was really shown, which is something that the domestic violence movement should have gotten ahead of years and years ago. But, you know, when you're sort of part of that machine, I think it just keeps running, which is scary, but I think true and really points to the distinct need for racial justice and police reform and how that will impact the domestic violence movement. It's all so interconnected. Any other questions right now? Okay, well, if you have any, please interrupt me, because I would much rather talk to you all than continue to give you information that maybe you have some holes around. And so, like, please, like, let's stop and let's discuss while we can. So I assume that most of you have heard of the Violence Against Women Act. Great. So the Violence Against Women Act was originally established in 1994. It was due specifically to, and I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but there was a wild increase nationally in domestic violence homicides, very much correlated with the O.J. Simpson case. And so in '94, the Violence Against Women Act was put into place, and it really gave a strong federal presence to the idea that survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, now human trafficking, need specific funding that will support them and their safety in a more robust manner. So what VAWA did originally was establish funding and establish sort of the idea that domestic violence is a real problem. There are many, many communities still that if you ask them about domestic violence, they will say that it doesn't happen within their community. I'm Jewish, and in the Orthodox community, there's a huge stigma around the idea that domestic violence may or may not happen in that community. Now, if you talk to folks one-on-one, they will quickly say, yes, it does, without problem, without question. But on the whole, it's denied. And so, and I can just speak from my community in that perspective, but it happens in many communities. And what VAWA did was say, no survivor's experience is real, which is so powerful. Like, I just don't think that there's a lot of federal legislation that's like, we believe you, you know? That's like not really what the federal government's about. So, really powerful. So then it was reauthorized in 2005. And what the critical thing that happened for us in 2005 is that there was a link drawn between domestic violence and homelessness. This was a link that hadn't been drawn prior. So what happened then was HUD was able to adopt VAWA and enact VAWA, saying that there are specific protections that exist within VAWA that if you receive HUD-funded housing, you have to follow. Now, there is not like a VAWA enforcement agency, which I'm sure is shocking to all of you. So we say that it needs to be enforced, but it's much like most human rights legislation that, like, on paper and within the community, it causes great discussion and sometimes can put protections in place that are meaningful, but on the whole, it doesn't have that enforcement behind it, and that can be a real problem. Again, then, what's so important is that we're all familiar with it in a way that, like, if it does need to be enacted, survivors can be supported in that way, and folks that are providing housing can be held accountable if need be. So then in 2013, it was reauthorized. And it was expanded to include survivors of sexual assault and human trafficking, which there are all sorts of different organizations that work with folks that have experienced different crimes. But what I can tell you is that a survivor of domestic violence likely has also experienced sexual assault. A survivor of sexual assault may have also experienced domestic violence. And human trafficking, I think that we have a very specific sort of like view of what that might be in our heads. But what we heard today at lunch was a story about human trafficking. And that was our colleague's grandmother. So this is all very close to us, right? And so the more that we can understand and know how this impacts the folks that are needing housing the most, the better. And then in 2022, it was reauthorized and expanded to include economic justice support, which is really exciting because, as Tara said, the majority of folks that don't leave abusive relationships is because they can't afford to. And the federal government is seeing that and realizing that. It doesn't mean that they're giving away money, but it does mean that it is seen, which is good. So these are the key reauthorization components of VAWA 2022. And as we can see here, the same protections are maintained year over year, which is great. There are a couple things that have happened within the housing world specifically, and we now have a VAWA director at HUD, which is exciting. She's really nice. We like her. She gets what we're all doing, so that's love. She's an attorney. She's done housing rights work forever. So like she really lives at this intersection between housing and domestic violence, and really is able to educate her colleagues at HUD about how important this is. Again, she is not VAWA enforcement, but the more we know, the better. And then. There was a lot of data that was shared about economic security and survivors. And we put some data points up here, but like the vast majority of single mothers are living in economic insecurity. And the vast majority of single women lack economic security. So again, we see this gender impact, and what this doesn't even take into account is the way that we still see redlining happen all of the time, and that BIPOC folks often can't access the housing that they deserve. And so when you see the intersection of all of that, it almost feels impossible to sort of get out of. Having federal legislation that recognizes it is really important. As I said, HUD adopted VAWA and continues to do so, which is great. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but what's important to know is that one of the ways that VAWA is enforced, I should put that in quotations, is by survivors saying that this is what happened to them, and so then a protection can be enacted. HUD has a form that you can give to a survivor, and the survivor can fill out that form saying, yes, I did experience domestic violence or sexual assault. They don't have to detail the story, but there is often this burden of proof that's put on survivors, which is terribly unfair. And so what the important takeaway from this is that if you have a survivor saying this is what happened to them, believe them. And then there is no reason in the world for them to jump through a million hoops to then prove folks don't have to get protection orders. Folks don't have to get restraining orders. Like, those are not requirements for VAWA protections to be enacted. A survivor just has to say, this is what happened to me. Now, we all know it's more complex than that, but at a high level, that's the important takeaway. And then I'm just going to wrap up real quick, Tara. So these are the things that we would like you to remember when you are supporting survivors. Focus on safety, confidentiality, and work to be trauma-informed. This is the same thing that anyone that you're working with also deserves. And so it's nothing special or unique to serve survivors. It is serving everyone that you already are. It's supporting those that are serving folks that are needing housing and homeless access. the important thing to remember is that you have to ask, and you have to be willing to be open and have the conversation with folks to make sure that they're getting the resources that they need and being able to enact the protections that they deserve. So this is our contact information. We don't have cards because of the pandemic. Isn't that weird? Like, our organization was just like, no, we're not doing that anymore. So this is our info. We have a shared email address, though, at PCADV, which is housing@pcadv.org. Please reach out to us there. We come to organizations and do trainings all the time. We are looking to partner statewide with organizations that are also working toward a common cause. We want to be able to support your work in any way that we can to destigmatize what it means to work with and serve survivors, and particularly in housing work. So if there's anything we can do to help, we're here for you. And if you have any questions, we're happy to take them, except I think that we're done with time. So thank you. Sure.
Terry, come on up. Thank you so much, Marie and Tara, for the presentation. Clearly, we need more time to really get into some more action steps to walk away with, but I appreciate you being here, sharing that information, especially your contact information. Please record that. And on behalf of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, I want to present you both with plaques. Just appreciating you being here, taking the time to share your knowledge and impart on us how we can help domestic violence survivors. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Renessa.
Thanks again. So I guess we will be convening in the Dell Theater for the closing remarks. Thank you.